Alright, hey everybody. I'm not going to beat around the bush or anything, but here's my open fortress weapon tier list, and I'm going to do my best to explain everything fully. And first up, I'll explain each of the tiers. Everything here is relatively ordered, so like the lightning gun would be slightly worse than the rocket launcher, or the railgun would be slightly worse than the lightning gun. I'll do my best to explain when the tier ordering gets hazy or I'm unsure, but I've done my best to rank the relative usability, utility, and like overall powerfulness, and any other factors that I came across. So getting into the tier explanations, here we have the god weapons. These weapons are basically designed around being over-centralizing and overpowered. They're only outclassed in very specific circumstances, and their major downside is related to how little they spawn and their little ammo capacity, and that sort of plays into how they're designed and how they spot on maps. But in a strict tier list ranking of which like you went up in a fair fight, I think these weapons would always be king. S tier weapons, now these are what I'm going to refer to as like the regular weapons because the god weapons are a little bit odd out in that situation, but S tier weapons are the core and most important, best to have weapons. In an ideal situation, I'd always want to have at least one of these guns on me. And when I spawn onto a map, these are the weapons I'm keeping my eyes peeled for, especially if I don't know the map. A tier weapons, these are pretty nice guns. They serve as really important specialist kind of usages, or really good generalist weapons. They're not as good as S tier, of course, but they're definitely weapons I'd like to have. Or weapons I'm happy with like getting. But B tier weapons, these are getting the guns I might end up regretting picking up, or guns that I tend to feel are overshadowed or moderate specialization. So in this case, it means like the generalists one tier above would be equally matched to the specialists on the tier below. C tier, these are weapons that I'm either forced to use due to no other pickups or might use as a last resort. The pistol as a starter is just kind of like forced to be here. I'll get into explaining that a little bit later. And D tier are weapons that I intentionally avoid or absolute last resort if I waste all 200 pistol cap shots, or I guess 212, but you get the point. Alright, and with all that cleared up, let's get into the meat of the list. In God weapons, we have the quad launcher and the Gib, or the BFG, whatever you want to call it. In my opinion, hands down for a fair fight, if I could choose any weapon and I was dead set on winning, it would have to be the quad launcher. This weapon in a 1v1 situation is a practical instant win button. You have 4 homing rockets that deal great damage, good at long range, good at close range as long as they're not close enough to make you deal lethal damage with splash. There's almost nothing this weapon just can't do. I guess the low clip size spare ammo, or low spare ammo, and like the low map spawn rate are sort of the disadvantages to it, but I've already explained that's sort of how they're designed. And next up is the Gib, and I put these in a deliberate order like this because it has almost exact similar strengths to the quad launcher. Small downsides are no homing projectiles, which is a funny downside in the grand scheme of things. But in order to just compare, I think I have to say that. And a delay while shooting. These make it worse in general situations because with a quad launcher, you with a quad launcher, you don't really need to anticipate when you're needing to shoot. With a Gib, you kind of need to anticipate when you're trying to shoot just because of the weapon delay, while you get the instant feedback with the click on the quad launcher. This weapon is still ridiculously powerful, and it's very over centralizing in a 1v1 scenario, and it might actually be better than the quad launcher in the situation in which I would describe as like shooting a herd of enemies, maybe in like Infection, but I haven't really played Infection enough yet, and I'll need to like check around those maps to see if there's a Gib somewhere around there. Maybe I'll get some sick 48 infected kill frag or something like that. Anyway, since both of these weapons have similar weaknesses and, god weapons, I guess I've been kind of dubbing them, I kind of have to put them in a tier on their own. Like, it's sort of hard to compare these to the other weapons, and like maybe you could make an argument that a railgun on 100% aimbot mode would beat these, but that's sort of like an inhuman scenario that isn't really useful for a human tier list. And also, it's just like in most other human situations, these weapons are probably better. Anyways, now that that's cleared up, we'll get onto the real part of the tier list. So, in my opinion, the best weapon in the game, excluding the god weapons, and I'm going to start meaning that every time I say the best, second best, third best, and etc., has to be the rocket launcher. I think it's really hard to argue that any one weapon is better than the rocket launcher. The only real weakness is that it doesn't provide a long range weapon, and that's really scraping the bottom of the barrel. Aside from that, the rocket launcher has high burst damage with amazing combo potential, can pre-fire around corners, something that very few weapons can do at the rocket launcher's leisure, and of course is easily the most accessible and quick movement option. I mean, the usages of the rocket launcher are pretty much endless. You can pop people up and fire another rocket at them, pop people up and lightning gun or railgun them, use rockets to start an auto hop retreat. Rocket jumping itself is pretty much its own skill set. This weapon is basically my first priority when I spawn onto a new map and I'm trying to discover my surroundings. And in my opinion, the second best weapon in the game is really the lightning gun. This is yet another weapon that will immediately grab my attention as an important map location if I see it on a map I'm not used to. Single-handedly, probably, or not probably, this is single-handedly the most powerful close-range hit scan weapon, that continuous hit scan or rapid-fire hit scan. And for good reason. It's not particularly easy to use, but I feel like when I first picked up this weapon, I felt like the hitbox was too generous. Through some personal testing, I found it actually isn't generous, it's really accurate. So I feel like what I might be noticing is a weird combination of high ping or network settings or something. Just general jank with everybody on like at least 200 ping. Server regions have been getting better, which I respect, but I feel like that's still something that just makes this weapon feel weird in general. It's a weird conversation for a different time. I could probably make a whole video on it. But this weapon is back to the more important topics. This weapon is probably the most potent finisher offer kind of tool. It can get comboed into spectacularly with any decent burst damage or movement inhibiting shot, and consequently the weapon itself deals pretty good knockback, which makes it even better on unsuspecting or inexperienced people. And this weapon actually has really nice range, despite being limited to close range or medium range. It's really hard to find a major downside with this gun. It's ridiculously powerful. And the third best weapon in the game, I say the third best because I say it kind of weird because I think you could make an argument that the railgun is better than the lightning gun or maybe even better than the rocket launcher, but I'm going to put it at third best right here because it's all down to personal aim. Like if you're a 3000% aimbot user, then this weapon is easily like the god weapon of its own. But for like most of us humans, I'll say, maybe we'll have some days where we're doing really good or we'll have some days where we're doing pretty mediocre. I think this weapon is it evens out to being probably third best in the game. If you're ridiculous with hitting those 240 headshots, it's practically unbeatable though. It's good for comboing into, like you can rocket into the rail pretty good. I think most of the combos are defined by what I can rocket into or whatever. On a good day, I might prioritize this weapon over the other two. Like maybe on longest yard, I'll make more of an effort to go out to that far off island. But overall, I feel like third best weapon in the game is a relatively accurate place for me to put it. I feel like I, I can confidently say like the rockets are better than lightning, but if I were to confidently say rails, it's sort of a blur to me because I feel like some days I'm like, oh yeah, rail is ridiculously overpowered, and then some days I'm like, rail is really only a high B tier weapon. It's just a weird kind of blur thing. I'm confident at where it is. Anyways, now that we're out of top 3 category and we're out of S tier, looks like we're about A tier. I think I'm going to start going through this a little bit quicker. And starting out with A tier, I think the Tommy gun is a pretty decent placement for here. It has high ammo. It's a mid-range rapid-fire hit scan gun that relatively serves its specialist kind of class, I guess. It's really hard to go wrong with such a basic weapon design. It has its obvious downfalls, like it can be relatively inconsistent at medium range. It requires good tracking. The random spread is a little bit odd, but it's good at what it does and it's very consistent. And one down, I'd put the super shotgun. This weapon is probably the most polarizing in terms of like best versus worst case scenario with it, because in its specific specialization, it's absolutely the best at what it does. Like nothing beats point blank range with this weapon, and that's a pretty common scenario with how crazy this game's movement is. But being with, or one of the only weapons with like a one-hit KO, it has to be like really good. In most other situations, I think it's like pretty shoddy. You can kind of use it as like a mid-range 30 damage pop, and you can finish people off with it. But I kind of only resort to that when I'm desperate or if I'm kind of fumbling around and I think I have a regular shotgun now. I can't sometimes play with view models disabled, by the way, which is why that happens. And right below the super shotgun is the regular shotgun itself. I'd want to act like the regular shotgun and the super shotgun are really far apart, because in your head, I feel like the super shotgun is much more satisfying and it feels much more cool to get the kill. But in reality, I think they're pretty evenly matched. The super shotgun is trading consistency for the X factor, and the X factor is basically like when you pop off and you're just hitting everything and you're like doing really good and you start snowballing into a lot of ridiculous frags and stuff like that. But the problem with the X Factor is that it can be hard to get consistent placings with it. In the same regard, I think the Railgun has a very high X Factor because you can get ridiculous frags with it. But back to the Super Shotgun, it has this high X factor, but the regular shotgun has this really nice consistency that I sometimes actually prefer over the super shotgun. Like, I definitely would prefer the regular shotgun as a comboing weapon. Like, I hit a rocket and then I need to reset to like a sort of more neutral scenario, and I need to like peek them again, and they're at mid range. I definitely prefer a regular shotgun. It's synergizes more with other weapons, while the super shotgun is more of a hype gun to use on its own. So I think they're both very evenly matched in this regard, but I'm going to have to say that the regular shotgun is just slightly worse. And right below the default shotgun is one of my least favorite weapons in the game, which is the chain gun or the minigun or whatever you want to call it. I genuinely think this is one of the worst feeling weapons in the game, but it's absolutely ridiculous how good it is. You can get the drop on like 5 people on like back fort where you drop down off the whole tower, and while they're all occupied trying to fight each other, you can just mow them down one by one with a chain gun. And while that's applicable for quite a large number of other guns, this gun just feels really weird to use. And I think the main reason is the key mechanic in it, which is the high spread. The concept of random spread at such a large scale in this game really does not feel good, and I know I've been stressing that so much. But at mid-range, the chain gun, it just feels like either a decent gun because you get lucky with spread, or it feels like you're shooting a pea shooter that can't hit crap and it does 2 damage. It's such a weird, polarizing, odd mechanic. I don't know how I feel about it. I feel like if you got consistent luck with this gun, it would easily be just like top of A tier, better than Tommy gun for sure. At close range, it's absolutely ridiculous. It's like a rapid fire shotgun. And at long range, well, long range is practically useless, but at like mid range, it's so inconsistently weird. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying this weapon should be totally absent of random spread. That would make it either way too good or way too stupid. In the grand scheme of things, random spread is sort of a necessary evil to make these guns conceptually work. However, this doesn't stop the chain gun from really feeling inconsistent, odd, ridiculously powerful in some situations. I feel bad about the placement here because I feel like you can really just get away with ridiculous bunny hopping, or like you can chain an explosive jump into bunny hopping, pull out your minigun and just mow through people. And I feel like it's not a very fun way to play this game. It's not fun to play against. It's not fun to play as. I'm relatively confident in this placement right here, but it just feels leaves a bad taste in my mouth. And right below the minigun is the SMG, and you might be thinking, but wait, the SMG is essentially a reskin Tommy gun, and it only has slight changes. How can there be so many guns in between it and the Tommy gun? And my answer to that is that these guns in A tier are so close together in power that it's about the same amount of differences as the Tommy gun and the SMG. I know that's sort of a cop-out answer to what I feel about the SMG. On my honest thoughts about the SMG, they only have one key difference that leads to mostly placebo differences. I think the SMG sounds and looks more satisfying to aim and hit, while the Tommy gun feels more unwieldy, like a spray down weapon that I feel worse aiming with. It makes no sense statistically, since I've done a few tests. The spread looks to be near identical, the damage is near identical, and the only real difference is ammo size. but they just feel totally different in my brain. I don't really know how to describe it, and it's totally biased. I understand if you're listening to this right now and you're just like, this is absolutely ridiculous and doesn't belong on like an objectified tier list, but I don't know. It's a weird blend, and I feel like A tier is tightly packed together. Honestly, I feel like all of the tiers are relatively packed together, but I like to try to relatively order them just to make it a little bit more meaningful. And with that, we're in B tier. Starting out, we have the revolver. This weapon feels ridiculously satisfying to aim and use, but in the grand scheme of things, it just feels outclassed. Or it has this like strange sort of X factor. It's not as good as the shotgun for close range, and it's not as good as like spray down hit scan for medium range, but it almost feels like its own sort of hand cannon or like a mini sniper rifle or a mini railgun. It's hard to explain how satisfying this gun is to use to finish off people. Was really considering putting it as the last gun in A tier just because of how fun and satisfying to use it is, but I don't prioritize this gun as much as A tier guns, nor do I think it's as good as those guns. It requires a lot of aiming for what it is, and I really like this gun, but it's just hard to justify as anything above B tier. And trailing behind the revolver, we have the China Puff, and a lot of the same thoughts are carrying over. It's very satisfying to use. The Rex feel meaty and satisfying. It has multi-purpose use with grenade jumping and light pre-fire situations, but I feel in most situations you can just sort of beat this gun with clean strafing and weird movements, and you can kind of out-aim people in DM situations. Or, I mean, deathmatch situations. I know that sounds a little weird, but like you can sort of out-aim people in 1v1 situations with this gun, and I don't doubt there's some like pipe Jesus out there that can just kick my teeth in with this gun. But I feel like in the grand scheme of utility, I feel like it's relatively lower. And just from what I've seen him, how I've used it, it's B tier. And much like the China Puff, I feel like the Dynamite is the same in this regard. But since the Dynamite is stuck at a 3 clip size, it's a bit worse. I like the ability to charge it, especially for jumping, and that also means that you can kind of like walk into a fight while you're charging it to get a more instantaneous shot out. Or you can like, I feel like I thought this weapon was a completely different type of weapon before I realized how to charge it, and it has more pre-fire capability than the China Buff, but anybody with a brain can avoid the mini dynamites. Either that, or you have to get really unlucky by walking into a room with it already there. More unlucky than walking into a direct rocket pre-fire. Direct rocket pre-fires don't have as big of a sound and a visual cue. Like, it's certainly possible to abuse the pre-fire ability of this weapon, but it's not nearly as potent as the rocket launcher, and it's not nearly as good as most of the A tier guns in a 1v1 situation. It's pretty fun to use this weapon to close off people's movement options, specifically in a 1v1, and then you can kind of pepper them with your pistol, and that also works especially well if they're also doing bad in weapon variety. So it's really fun to use, but I just feel like it's outclassed. And right under the dynamite, I have two weapons that I'm relatively unsure of. First up is the AR, or as the community likes to call it, the AK. I don't know why people call this weapon the AK, but it's kind of funny. It's a potent weapon that's better than what I originally thought. I feel like a lot of weapons are you pick it up and you just kind of get confused at them and you're like, eh. And then after you use it for quite a while, you sort of get used to it. But I still feel like the AR are sort of locked into long range targets with telegraphed movement, or close range targets that are unsuspecting. It's certainly pretty powerful, but I don't know if I'd call it better than the Dynamite. Definitely not better than the China Puff. I can confidently say I wouldn't put it above A tier, but it's still in a little bit of an odd spot. I think its best situation is in long range. Although even then it's outclassed by rails, but even then you could make the argument that since this is the only other weapon which occupies a long range playstyle, it could be even higher tiered. And also, since it does relatively decent at close and mid range, you could say it would be higher. But I feel like since I'd just rather have almost anything else, like a projectile weapon for mid range, or rapid fire hit scan for mid range, or shotgun for close range, it's just sort of in a really weird spot. It's hard to make the call. I feel like in or, um or maps like, what's that arena map? Watchtower? I'd much rather have railgun. And I said back that loops back to the argument like, oh, since it's the only other weapon that fulfills a long range specialization, it has to be better. but I feel like it doesn't even do that quite well unless your enemies are really telegraphed. It's hard to use. 3-round burst is an odd mechanic, and I certainly like how it feels to use. I feel like there's a sort of misconception that it's like not good at all and it should just be removed from the game. I feel like it sort of serves its own purpose, but I don't know, it's sort of one of my last ideal weapons I'd go out of my way to grab just because it's so mentally unwieldy on when I'm supposed to be using this. You can certainly get some killer frags with this thing. It does a lot of damage, but I don't think I'd justify it above like the China Puff and Dynamite. And at the last gun in B tier, and the last gun that I probably would absolute or not ab the last gun I'd really go out of my way to grab, but even then it's like very situational is the nail gun. This weapon is really interesting because I think the first time you pick up the nail gun, you're kind of like, wow, this weapon sucks. And then you kind of transition into, wow, this weapon is actually really powerful. And then after you're using it for a while, it loops back around into, wow, this weapon is pretty bad. Like, it's not a great weapon, and I'd always rather have it than nothing, but I'd usually rather have stuff aside from it. Like, it's pretty potent in close range, and it might actually be one of the best weapons for close range, and getting the drop on enemies with this weapon, it is really powerful. But then again, getting the drop on an opponent at close range usually secures your win with every other gun. It's possible to use in other situations, like fighting for more guns, but it isn't really something that I'd look out of my way to do. It has a nice skill ceiling and fulfills the specialization honestly pretty well. I don't think it needs less needle drop, or if it does, maybe just minimally less. I wouldn't want to see it as like a mainstay medium range weapon. I think it's sort of really good at its close range kind of thing. And I don't want it to have indefinite range, which would make it more of a plasma gun, which would just be an annoying long range peppering tool. And I don't really think it needs buffed damage because it is quite good. It has a really quick firing rate with 20 damage pops. I'm pretty confident to put it as like the last weapon I'd willingly use because it's certainly not a weapon I'd want to like dive into using, but it's also still really potent in the right hands. And down into C tier, we have the weapons that are sort of just there, and it has one of my hottest takes for this game. Before we get into that, I'm going to talk about the pistol. I like the pistol. It's quite literally the definition of like if I have to use it, I will, but I'd prefer almost literally anything else. Well, maybe not the chainsaw. I'd use the pistol in many situations I wouldn't use a chainsaw. But that's actually exactly like the philosophy behind the starter weapon, and I think they really nailed it. It's really nice in the right hands too. It's probably the worst in every situation because there's always a gun for specific situations I'd rather have, but that's just like the ideal, isn't it? Like it's a starter weapon. If this weapon was too good, there'd be no reason to fight for other weapons. But if it was too bad, then you just feel like helpless. It's a pretty good desperation weapon, and you can actually find some situations in which I'd like to use this. Like medium range against low health enemies, I can pick them off with it. I can kind of pepper at them. Or as desperation, that's always there. Or a light combo weapon, like pop them up with a rocket, and since they're popped up with a rocket, I can just pepper them. I love the feel of this gun, to be quite honest. It's just since it perfectly fulfills the like ideal of a starter weapon, it's not good. Which is sort of a shame to say because I think it's honestly really nice. And anyways, it's time to talk about the chainsaw. Honestly, the chainsaw is ridiculously overrated meme garbage. Trimping is cool, but it's ridiculously unwieldy and it's too quick. Even if I wanted to chain trimping into bunny hops, I just fly too quick into the skybox. It's really, really easy to see where the enemy is coming from when they're using a chainsaw, and it only secures a kill on insanely surprised drops. Almost any fair fight, this gun, or not this gun, this weapon will be totally outclassed. One redeeming factor is that you could use a charge to sort of chain into a bunny hop and you'll retain some of the momentum, but that's an oddly time-consuming way to gain momentum. You could just spend that time bunny hopping, or spend that time trying to find an explosive weapon that will give you higher base momentum anyways. I'm not a fan of this weapon, and I really only use it if I can't get anything else and I'm just deciding to mess around. I don't really think it should be buffed because I don't think it should be centralizing. It's decent on closed down maps like back fort with tight spaces and many areas to surprise, which can be quite fun, but it gets majorly outclassed by any good gun. Like any S tier weapon will just destroy this weapon. Any mid-ranged weapon will basically destroy this weapon too. It's really in sort of an odd spot. Maybe like the nail gun loses to it because you have to be at close range. But then again, the super telegraphed movement of the chainsaw is just really hard to overcome. I feel like people overrate this weapon just because of solar light. I'm sorry, bro. And we're in the D tier. These are the bottom of the barrel weapons. Flamethrower is pretty much enough said. It's weak, extremely short ranged, and it has two slightly redeeming factors: Afterburn and Air Blast. Air Blast is quite interesting to play around with, but since servers are kind of buzzing around with 200 ping users, and I haven't quite got the rhythm down yet, it's been a while since I played Pyro, if I'm being honest, I find it hard to use. And I know that's sort of a me problem, but this tier list is subjective, as all tier lists are by nature. And I also think the other holdbacks from this weapon are just so bad that it has to be there. There are so many other non-projectile weapons that it's only a very small subset of fights in which my opponent is using the rocket launcher, because let's be honest, air blasting the grenades aren't very applicable unless they're being very, very obvious with their movement, and it's almost nearly impossible to reflect with it. And it's just like you better not be close range enough that you're just going off of 100% predictions. I think you're starting to see where sort of the dilemmas with this weapon's air blast mechanic are. I still think there's a lot of interesting aspects to the air blast mechanic. One time I saw a dev walking around on longest yard and he was air blasting then quick switching to a lightning gun to chain it into the knockback of the lightning gun. That's honestly pretty genius, and I'm going to have to try that out in arsenal mode one of these days. Although I such a shame that this weapon is just so ridiculously underpowerful. Like, Afterburn, which is the only other slightly redeeming factor, is only moderately powerful. With wep with maps that have water on them, Afterburn is almost completely mitigated, and with maps that you know where the health packs are, it's pretty much fully mitigated. I mean, I've died to Afterburn an oddly large amount of times just because the health packs are either despawned or too far away, or I don't know where they are. And I think this weapon has like a relatively almost passable damage. It's just such a shame I have to put it so low because I really like what they've done with this weapon. It's almost completely changed my perspective on the Pyro and default TF2. I used to think Pyro was a relatively uninteresting generalist class who sucked at everything and was fundamentally flawed. But now I think Pyro is a class that has potential to be really cool and actually take skill. It was honestly just as simple as changing the flame box size to be smaller to make this weapon take a ton more skill. It feels like a lightning gun, and I really love that. Afterburn is annoying. It feels more like a sort of like nagging kind of thing rather than something that I actually fear. I'd like for the Afterburn to be made more in realm with Jungle Inferno. And also I would like the damage output to be buffed and maybe increase the range, but I think that's a little bit of a slippery slope. I don't want this weapon to become a second lightning gun. It can retain aspects from the lightning gun, but if this weapon were to just become another lightning gun, I think it would be quite dumb. This weapon just feels like it does not enough damage for how close and precise you have to be for it to really actually deal or you have to be too close and precise for how little damage it does. I like what this weapon is going for, but honestly, I think this is the only weapon that is unwarrantedly low. Like all the other weapons you can sort of justify for being their tier list placements. Like, I think I've been describing these weapons in the best detail that I can and why I like to use them, why they're more applicable to certain situations. If there's any gun that's a bit of an outlier, it's definitely the flamethrower. It just feels like it kind of sticks out, which is a shame. I feel like it could be a really cool weapon. And the last weapon, or what I think is the absolute worst weapon in Open Fortress, is the crowbar. It's a absolute desperation weapon. It's made passable with stupidly high ping. It can be fun to mess around with, but it's seriously just not a good weapon. I avoid using it because it creates bad habits, and frankly, I'd rather be using the weapons that are well crafted and fun to use. It's just such a weird place for a weapon. I don't like the crowbar that much. I really dislike how people will sometimes just stop using their guns and charge at each other with a crowbar. I understand that's sort of like TF2 culture, where like people like to mess around and be silly, but I just don't particularly love it. I'd rather have a pistol duel. And underneath the tier list, we have the akimbo pistols. It's a true shame because I really loved these weapons. It was the cherry on top to what I considered this game's amazing starter weapon design. Like, imagine a scenario in which you find another user who doesn't have a starter weapon, so you're both stuck with your pistols, and you get the frag, and you get rewarded for getting that frag because then you get to upgrade your starter weapon into a marginally better version of the same starter weapon. I don't think it would be that much better in the grand scheme of things. Like if this weapon was still in the rotation, I think I would probably put it somewhere in B tier, maybe about here at most. Maybe if I was feeling insanely generous, I could say it's somewhat comparable to the SMG, but I really don't think it would be better than B tier in the grand scheme of things. Like I said, most of my memory from this weapon is quite hazy because it's been out of the rotation for so long. And if we're playing on Arsenal mode, I'd much rather just use the weapons that are actually better, that serve the same specialization. The servers were so overpopulated at one point because they were all on 24 players that I felt like this gun was more of a sort of side mechanic because nobody could get a weapon and people were getting frustrated with having to use the crappy starter pistol. So people started using the akimbo pistols because it was the better thing they could get, which was a relatively interesting mechanic. But now that the servers are bound back down to a moderate size and I'm not struggling to find weapons, which is a good thing, I feel like the akimbo pistols are sort of losing their place because when everybody has a weapon, they're sort of useless. And I feel like actually removing these from your list of weapons is what made people stop using it. I feel like these were sort of a gimmick that you take out in order to use the akimbo pistols because you thought they were conceptually cool. And it sort of distanced people from using some of the more lower end weapons on this tier list, which is quite sad. Anyways, all in all, that's pretty much all my thoughts on this game's weapon placements. If I'd want to end this by saying that I'm open to change on some of this. Like I've already said, I think some people could really kick my teeth in with China Puff, or maybe the revolver could actually be around A tier. Maybe on a perfect optimization, the nail gun and the AR are also a bit different. Although I think maybe the absolute bottom is pretty accurate to where I'd be at, and the absolute top of the tier list is accurate to where I'd want it to be. The mid-range weapons are sort of hard to place, but I've done my best to sort of counterbalance some of my own bias and thought processes along with my general rankings on their power, just to see where I relatively think everything stacks up. And again, I don't think this is the end-all be-all of my tier list. I might make an updated version. Of course, the devs might add extra guns. I hope they don't go overboard with adding 58,000 more reskinned SMGs. Jokes aside. But yeah, anyways, this is my first impressions. Hope you all enjoy.